Okay, the second comma rule is lists. Basically, the rule is that you need to use commas to separate items in a list. And there's two basic kinds of lists that require commas, so we'll take a look at both of those. The first is when you have 3 or more items in a list. That's kind of the basic rule. And the second is when you have 2 or more adjectives preceding a noun. So let's take a look at each of those. 3 or more items in a list, you're probably pretty comfortable with this rule. Basically, any kind of list that you generate, whether it's nouns, verbs, prepositional phrases, gerund phrases, subordinate clauses, any of those lists need commas to separate the list items. So for example, a list of simple nouns might read John ate peas, comma, pasta and pie. Just a quick note about this second comma here. This is called the Oxford comma. That's the comma that comes before the and. You may have heard people debate whether or not to include the Oxford comma, so it really is up to your discretion. It's pretty common today for people to go ahead and include that comma, so you may just want to do that to be kind of in the mainstream, but you'll never be asked on a quiz to differentiate between using and not using the Oxford comma because both are considered correct. Okay, so you could have a list of verbs like the baby kicked, screamed, and wailed. You could have a list of prepositional phrases such as Sarah looked for her keys behind the couch, comma, under the table, comma, and inside the drawer. You might have a list of gerund phrases such as Jerry's hobbies include collecting stamps, comma, biking mountain trails, comma, and reading literature. You might have a list of subordinate clauses such as those who study hard, comma, who get plenty of sleep, comma, and who eat a good breakfast will succeed on their exam. So this rule is pretty simple. You just need to identify your list items and insert a comma between them. The second type of list is a little bit more complicated, just because sometimes you do need to use a comma with adjectives preceding a noun, and sometimes you don't need to use a comma with adjectives preceding a noun. So let's take a few moments to differentiate between those two situations. You do use a comma when you're separating what are called coordinating adjectives. A coordinating adjective is when there are adjectives in a row that separately modify the noun. So let's look at an example. Red, comma, menacing ants descended upon the picnic. So in this case, we've got adjective number 1, red, adjective number 2, menacing, and basically it's just a series of adjectives, all of which modify our noun. So those are called coordinating adjectives. They're simply a separate list of adjectives that serve the same function to modify your noun. In that case, you do put a comma between those because it's simply a list of separate adjectives. You could have more than 2. You could have added red, comma, menacing, comma, irritating, ants, and the list could have gone on. But the idea is these are just separate adjectives all modifying the one noun. However, there's another type of list of adjectives called cumulative adjectives. This is when adjectives in a row don't separately modify the noun. Instead, the adjectives right before the noun modifies the noun, and the adjective before the adjective actually modifies the adjective, which sounds a little bit convoluted, so let's look at an example. In this case, you have classic Victorian mansion. Victorian definitely modifies mansion. It's telling you what era the mansion is. It's a Victorian mansion. However, notice classic is actually modifying Victorian. It's not a classic mansion, it's a classic Victorian mansion, talking about the classic Victorian era. In this case, we don't have 2 adjectives modifying the same noun like we did up here. Instead, we have an adjective modifying a noun and an adjective modifying an adjective. This is called a cumulative adjective, and you do not separate those adjectives with a comma. So here's kind of a quick trick. If you can put and in between your 2 adjectives and it makes sense, then you have a coordinating adjective. So I could have said red and menacing ants. That would have made perfect sense. It's telling me 2 different adjectives about ants. But down here, it wouldn't make sense to say classic and Victorian mansion. That doesn't make sense because classic isn't modifying mansion. So to separate those 2, I've now changed the meaning of the list. It's a classic Victorian mansion, not a classic mansion. So a trick, if you're not sure whether you have coordinating or cumulative adjectives, is to simply place an and in between the adjectives. If it makes sense, you've got coordinating adjectives and should include a comma. If it doesn't make sense, you've got cumulative adjectives and should not include a comma. So go ahead and pause the video, complete the practice exercise, and then resume the video to check your answers when you're done. All right, let's take a look at the answers and see how you did. This one is just a basic list of nouns. Sam plays soccer, comma, basketball, comma, and hockey. The second one, a nice list of verbs here. The vacationers can, comma, kickbox, comma, and karaoke. These are very simple lists. The marathon runners ran up State Street, comma, along the lake, comma, and around the park. A list of prepositional phrases. The chef spent the day sauteing, comma, marinating, comma, and flambeing. A list of gerunds. So you can see it doesn't really matter what you're listing. You simply include those commas to separate your list items. Number 5, movies that entertain, that surprise, comma, and that evoke emotion are generally the most effective. A list of subordinate clauses. The fat, bald man ate sausage ravenously. Okay, so now we've moved into our list of adjectives before a noun. So we have to figure out, does each of our adjectives modify the noun, or is it a cumulative adjective where they modify each other? In this case, fat does not modify bald, it modifies man. So because both of our adjectives are modifying our noun, we do include a comma to separate those adjectives. The fat, comma, bald man ate sausage ravenously. It's simply a list of adjectives modifying that noun. Number 7, the solid gold ring is a family heirloom. So let's put our trick into place. If I said the solid and gold ring is a family heirloom, it doesn't really make sense. I'm not saying the ring is solid, I'm saying it's solid gold. So because solid is in fact modifying gold and gold is modifying ring, we have that cumulative adjective situation. So I do not include a comma between solid and gold because solid is modifying gold and we don't separate what modifies another thing with a comma. The last one says the large red brick house stood majestically at the top of the hill. So I've got to figure out, do each of my adjectives modify my noun, or do my adjectives modify each other? In this case, large modifies house. It's not talking about the bricks. It's not saying the bricks are large. It's saying the house is large. And here you kind of have to decide, do you think red is modifying brick, or do you think red is modifying house? I think it probably makes most sense to consider that red is modifying brick. The red brick house, what kind of bricks? Oh, they're red brick. But if you had interpreted it that the red was modifying the house and there are simply 3 adjectives that modify house, you could probably make that argument. I would probably read it as the large, comma, red brick house, and I would probably just include that one comma, but keep red brick together because I think those two kind of modify each other. So that's a little bit trickier. You can see you have to kind of decipher what's modifying what to figure out the adjective list, but hopefully you got something along those lines. If that's tricky for you, feel free to call over your teacher for some help. So hopefully the list rule makes some good sense to you. You can go ahead and do your second practice exercise and try to write some sentences of your own. And that wraps up comma rule number 2.